I never imagined a Tuesday night could linger in your chest the way dessert does, sweet, but with an edge I couldn't place. Yet there I was, sitting across from her at that tiny Italian bistro, the kind of place where the lighting is too soft, the music too quiet, and every glance feels magnified. She arrived a few minutes late, not in a hurried way, but like she'd taken her time, choosing exactly how she wanted to enter a room. Mid-40s, poised, confident, yet there was an imperfection in her smile that made her human, approachable. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands curling along her jaw, and she wore a soft scarf that somehow smelled faintly of citrus and vanilla. I caught her scanning the restaurant as if she owned it, but with curiosity, not arrogance. "Sorry I'm late," she said, sliding into the booth opposite me. Her voice was calm, smooth, but there was a subtle warmth underneath that made me feel immediately exposed. I shrugged, trying to sound casual, though my fingers fidgeted with the corner of the menu. "No worries. I just got here myself." She tilted her head slightly, studying me in a way that felt impossible to ignore. I wondered if she noticed my hands trembling just a little when I set my glass of water down too loudly. "You look different than I imagined," she said softly, and I wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a gentle tease. The waiter brought our first course, and I realized my attention hadn't left her since she sat down. There was a small crease between her brows when she tasted the bruschetta, a little sigh, almost imperceptible, and I wanted to ask what she was thinking. But I didn't. I watched her instead, tracing the way she lifted her fork, the tilt of her shoulder, the way her eyes caught the candlelight. Somehow, we fell into a rhythm, talking about nothing important, books she'd read, restaurants she liked, the mild chaos of the city outside. I spoke more than usual, spilling details I normally kept to myself, and she listened. Not just politely, but with that deep attentiveness that makes you feel seen, really seen, for the first time. Then there was a pause. Not an uncomfortable one, exactly, but the kind that vibrates between people. Our eyes met across the table, lingering longer than it should have, and I realized my chest was tight, my palms sweating a little. She smiled, just the barest hint of a curve at her lips, and I caught myself staring a second too long. Without a word, she reached across the table to adjust the napkin near my plate. A simple, almost trivial gesture, yet I felt a shock of something, recognition, desire, curiosity, run through me. My hand twitched, wanting to brush hers, but I didn't. I sat still, my heart insisting on noticing everything. The warmth of her fingers near mine, the soft rustle of her scarf, the faint scent lingering in the air. Dessert arrived, and the moment dissolved into conversation again, but something had shifted. The subtle electricity wasn't in what we said, but in what wasn't said. It hovered in the space between us, a quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged openly, yet both of us felt. When she finally leaned back and laughed at something I said, just a soft, unguarded laugh, I realized I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way her eyes crinkled, the way her presence seemed to fill the booth, and that fleeting brush of her hand earlier. Something unspoken had begun tonight, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to leave me anytime soon. I hadn't expected to see her again so soon. Yet there she was, leaning over the counter at the bookstore, a stack of books trembling slightly in her hands. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the warm highlights in her hair and making the room feel quieter than it actually was. I can't reach that top shelf," she admitted, a small smile tugging at her lips, but there was a hint of fatigue under her eyes. Something unspoken lingered there, a weight I wasn't supposed to notice. "Here, I've got it," I said quickly, stepping around the counter. She moved just slightly, giving me space, and I felt the odd thrill of closeness. My fingers brushed the books as I handed them to her, and I caught her eyes darting away, then back again, like she was measuring how much she could trust me. She sighed softly, leaning against the counter, one hand brushing her hair back in a casual gesture that somehow wasn't casual at all. There was a tension in her shoulders, a quiet vulnerability I hadn't seen before. And in that moment, I noticed the small things, the delicate curve of her wrist, the faint crease between her brows, the way her lips parted ever so slightly when she laughed at my clumsy joke. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice lighter than before, but still carrying a guarded edge. She shifted the books onto the counter, then paused, glancing at the floor like she was hesitating over whether to say more. I stayed quiet, just watching, aware that the silence was a kind of conversation in itself. Her laugh came again, low and soft, but it didn't reach her eyes. I saw the tiredness there, subtle lines that weren't just from age but from years of holding things in. I wanted to ask her about it, to tell her she didn't have to hide, but I didn't. Instead, I let the quiet fill the space, letting her set the pace. There was a moment, brief and almost fragile, where she straightened and looked directly at me. Her gaze was steady, but unreadable, like she was testing whether I'd noticed the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted a stack of novels. I did notice. I noticed everything. She laughed again, lighter this time, almost involuntarily, and I realized I could spend hours just studying these small movements, memorizing them without needing her to say anything. There was a charge in the air, subtle but undeniable, like a gentle pull I wasn't meant to resist. Then she gathered her things, her movements careful and precise, as if she were protecting herself. She turned to leave, and for just a heartbeat, our eyes met again. I caught that flicker, a mix of hesitation and acknowledgement, and it made my chest tighten in a way that felt almost dangerous. I watched her go, the space she left behind feeling larger than the room itself. And even now, I can't stop thinking about the way she leaned, the softness of her laugh, the quiet weight she carried in her silence. Something is unfolding here, something delicate, fragile, and I'm not sure I'm ready for it, but I can't turn away. The rain tapped against the window in uneven rhythms, the streetlights outside flickering in the puddles. I hadn't planned to stay late at the bookstore, but neither had she, apparently. We were stacking returned books together in the back room, a narrow space that smelled of paper and dust, and something faintly like her perfume lingering in the air. She leaned over the table to reach the bottom shelf, and I instinctively stepped closer, my shoulder brushing hers. The contact was brief, accidental, or maybe not, but it sent a small jolt through me. She froze just a fraction longer than necessary, then straightened and gave me a polite smile, though her eyes lingered on mine. "Do you ever come here this late?" I asked, trying to fill the silence, but my voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. She shrugged, a gesture that was casual but hesitant. "Sometimes. The quiet is easier at night." Her gaze drifted to the floor, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edges of the shelf like she needed something to steady herself. I wanted to say something, anything, that might bridge the distance between us, but I stopped myself. My chest tightened at the thought of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. A sudden buzz from her phone startled both of us. She picked it up reluctantly, and I caught the name flashing on the screen. Her ex. She glanced at it, fingers hovering, then slid it into her pocket without answering. I didn't ask, though the curiosity burned like a quiet fire inside me. There was something in that pause, a mix of guilt and hesitation, and I realized how fragile this moment had become. We went back to arranging the books, the proximity unbearable yet unspeakable. My hand lingered near hers as I passed a thick volume across the table, our fingers brushing again. She looked up, eyes catching mine, and I saw a flicker of something unspoken, want, hesitation, confusion. I wanted to close the distance, to reach out and bridge it, but I didn't. I couldn't. A flash of lightning illuminated the room for a brief second, highlighting the curve of her neck, the delicate line of her jaw. For a heartbeat, it felt like we existed in a world of our own making, one that could vanish the instant she decided to step back. Her laugh broke the spell, soft and nervous, and I realized she was aware of the same tension that made my palms sweat. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus on the books, on anything but the heat in my chest and the pull in my gut. And then she leaned over to place a stack of novels on the lower shelf again, closer than before. My hand hovered an inch away from hers. I could feel her breath, faint and warm, as if the room itself had shrunk to fit only us. But before anything could happen, before a word, a touch, a confession, she straightened, stepping back with a small, almost apologetic smile. "I should probably get going," she murmured, and the spell broke. I watched her leave, rain dripping from the hem of her coat, and felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing against my chest. That moment, just on the edge of happening, would haunt me far longer than the storm outside. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple hunched-over laptops and the hum of the espresso machine. I sat across from her, hands wrapped around my mug, wishing it would warm more than just my fingers. She hadn't said much since we met, but the air between us was thick, full of words neither of us wanted to speak aloud. Finally, she exhaled, a quiet sigh that seemed to carry all the tension of the week. "Do you ever wonder why we keep doing this?" Her eyes didn't leave mine, but there was a flicker of something fragile in them. Hesitation, fear, maybe longing. I blinked, uncertain. "Doing what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This," she said softly, gesturing vaguely between us. "All this closeness, these little moments that feel like they mean more than they should. Do you feel it too?" Her voice wavered, low and unsure, and for a second she looked almost like a younger version of herself, stripped of all the confidence she usually carried. I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it aloud felt like breaking something delicate. I notice," I admitted finally, "more than I probably should." She laughed, but it was hollow, a sound that barely filled the space. "See? That's what I mean. We can't just pretend this is normal. And yet, here we are." Her fingers traced the rim of her mug, slow, deliberate, as if she were trying to anchor herself to the table. I wanted to reach across and touch her hand, to reassure her, or maybe myself, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch between us. Long moments passed, punctuated only by the distant hiss of the coffee machine and the occasional clink of a cup. "Do you ever think about what this could mean?" she asked, eyes searching mine like she was afraid of the answer. I swallowed, my heart hammering. "All the time," I whispered, though the words felt inadequate. "But I don't know what to do with it." She looked down, biting her lip, and I saw her shoulders slump, just slightly, under the weight of something she wasn't saying. I realized then that this wasn't about books or coffee or stolen moments. It was about understanding ourselves in a way we hadn't allowed before. I wanted to speak, to offer her some kind of clarity, but nothing came. Only the quiet settled over us like a fog, heavy and intimate, and I felt closer to her than ever, yet further away than I had any right to be. Finally, she lifted her gaze, eyes glistening with a quiet storm I couldn't name. Maybe some things shouldn't have answers," she murmured. "Maybe some things are just meant to exist in the space between us." I nodded, not trusting my voice, not trusting the fragile balance of the moment. And then she added, so softly it felt like a whisper against the world, "But it still hurts, not knowing if you see me the way I see you." I found her in the quiet corner of the bookstore again, curled slightly in the armchair near the poetry section. She had a small envelope in her hands, fingers tracing the edges, knuckles pale. I paused at the threshold, sensing a tension that hadn't been there before. "Is that personal?" I asked carefully, not wanting to intrude. She looked up at me, eyes softened but distant, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "Yeah," she murmured. "It's from a long time ago." Her voice faltered, barely above a whisper. "Someone I lost. It's silly, maybe, but I didn't expect to feel this again." I crouched slightly to meet her gaze, trying to offer some comfort without overstepping. "It's not silly," I said softly. "I get that. Sometimes the past, it lingers in ways you don't notice until it hits you unexpectedly." She nodded, biting her lip. He was my first love. Thought I'd never move on, and then life happened. I haven't really talked about him in years." Her fingers trembled slightly over the envelope. Seeing this, it just brought it all back. I noticed the way her hands shook, subtle but undeniable, and my chest tightened. There was a rawness to her now, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. "I can't imagine how hard that must be." Her gaze drifted away, and I followed it, taking in the faint crease between her brows, the tiny sigh that escaped her lips. It's strange, she admitted, voice low. Even after all this time, I still feel something. And I hate that it catches me off guard, especially now. I swallowed, unsure whether to reach out or give her space. The air between us felt heavier, charged in a way that wasn't entirely about the past. There was a pull, subtle and insistent, that made me want to bridge the gap, but the right words weren't there. She opened the envelope slowly, revealing a folded letter, yellowed at the edges. I watched her eyes flick across the page, glimmering with moisture, and for a moment, the room fell silent except for the soft rustle of paper. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. The moment was already seismic in its quiet way. Funny, she whispered, voice catching. How someone you haven't seen in decades can still exist in your chest like this. Her shoulders shook slightly, but she didn't cry. Not yet. I wanted to tell her something, anything, that might lessen the weight, but my voice caught. Instead, I stayed near, letting my presence speak. She shifted, almost imperceptibly, until our knees brushed under the small table. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. And then, with a faint, almost inaudible sigh, she finally met my gaze. The vulnerability in her eyes was electric, like a secret shared in a room of one, and I realized I'd never seen her so raw, so human. That single glance held more than words ever could, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. We ended up in the little park behind the bookstore, the one with the wooden bench that had seen better days. The sky was pale with the last hints of sunset, and the air smelled faintly of wet earth from the earlier rain. She sat beside me, her coat brushing against mine, neither of us speaking at first. I wanted to break the silence, to say something clever or comforting, but the words felt clumsy compared to the quiet understanding that had settled between us. Instead, I just watched her, noticing the soft tilt of her head, the way her hands rested lightly on her lap, fingers occasionally brushing the edge of the bench. You're quiet, she finally said, voice low, casual, but not casual enough to hide the weight behind it. I'm just here, I answered truthfully, letting the words linger in the air. They felt safer than anything I might have said about how I really felt. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, her gaze drifting to the trees swaying gently in the wind. Me too, she murmured. Then, after a pause, she added, I think. I'm tired of pretending some things aren't real. I swallowed, heart tightening. This was it, the acknowledgement, quiet but absolute. I didn't need her to say more. I reached slowly, almost hesitantly, and let my fingers brush against hers. She didn't pull away. She barely shifted, just enough for our hands to rest together naturally. A small, fragile bridge over everything unspoken. The world around us seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of us on that weathered bench. I noticed the subtle lines around her eyes, the soft exhale that escaped her lips when she leaned slightly closer. No words were necessary. Her presence, the shared space, said everything we hadn't dared to say before. I've wanted to tell you, she began, then stopped, laughing softly at herself. I don't need to, I guess. You already know. I do, I said, letting my thumb trace the back of her hand, careful, deliberate. And you know I'm not going anywhere. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, I saw her fully let go of the tension she'd carried for weeks, maybe years. There was relief, tenderness, and something deeper that neither of us tried to define just yet. We didn't need labels. We didn't need declarations. We just needed this moment, and it was enough. The bench creaked under our subtle shift closer, her head tilting slightly until it rested near mine. Not on my shoulder, not pressed, just near enough that the warmth was undeniable. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the simplicity of it fill me, a quiet collapse into something inevitable, something earned. When the wind rustled the leaves above, it sounded like the world was exhaling with us. No grand words, no dramatic gestures, just a gentle, mutual understanding that whatever this was, it had finally begun. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting everything in soft amber. I felt the quiet finality of it, that some things, once felt, can't be ignored, that some connections, once earned, can't be undone. It's been months since that night on the park bench, and I still think about it. Not like an ache, but like a quiet echo that settles in your chest and makes ordinary moments feel a little warmer. Looking back, I realize how much changed in both of us without either of us announcing it. She learned that vulnerability doesn't have to be weakness, that letting someone in, even slowly, doesn't diminish who she is. And I learned that patience, attention, and a willingness to sit in silence can sometimes say more than words ever could. We still have our routines, our little rituals that aren't flashy or dramatic, but they're ours. The way she smiles when I hand her a coffee, just the way she likes it. The subtle glance she gives when I crack a bad joke. The evenings spent in quiet corners, hands brushing without the need for a confession. Love, I've realized, doesn't have to shout to exist. It can be soft, almost invisible, and still shake you to the core. Sometimes I catch myself replaying those early moments. The glance over the counter, the brush of hands in the back room, the rain tapping against the window, and I realize that what felt forbidden or uncertain then has become steady, familiar, and yet still thrilling. That tension, that electricity, hasn't disappeared. It's matured, settled into something resilient. And maybe that's the lesson. The slow-burning kind of love, the one that grows in quiet spaces, that demands patience, care, and attention, is the kind that lasts. It's the kind that doesn't need declarations or grand gestures to be felt deeply. It's the kind that transforms ordinary moments into memory, connection, and something that feels like home. I don't know what the future holds. Life has a way of surprising you, sometimes cruelly, sometimes beautifully. But I do know this. When I see her, when I feel her presence beside me, even in silence, I understand the truth of it. We're here. We've arrived. And somehow, that's everything. So, if this story made you feel something, even just a flutter of recognition or a pang of longing, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this? Because sometimes, the quietest connections leave the loudest impressions.